What happens to a man when the one person who held him steady, the one constant through decades of public duty and private storms, suddenly vanishes forever? Imagine standing in the grandeur of Kensington Palace, or gazing at the timeless walls of Buckingham Palace, only to feel more alone than you've ever been. That is the haunting reality for the Duke of Kent. His beloved wife, Catherine, Duchess of Kent, has passed away at the age of 92. And in the quiet aftermath of this loss, the Duke has whispered words that shook those who heard them. "I won't survive without her." Think about that for a moment. A royal figure who has stood in the shadows of history, who has shaken hands with kings, presidents, soldiers, and citizens alike, now reduced to a grief so raw, so overwhelming, that survival itself feels uncertain. It is not the kind of polished line you'd expect from a man trained his entire life to keep composure. It is not a statement crafted for the press. It is the cry of a heart broken beyond repair. But why does this moment matter now? Why does the passing of Catherine, Duchess of Kent, ripple beyond the walls of Windsor, beyond the private grief of an aging duke? Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates, because it speaks to something much deeper, the humanity of the monarchy. For years, we've been told that royals are symbols, duty, strength, tradition. But when a 92-year-old woman, a quiet yet transformative figure in the royal family, slips away into eternity, and her husband is left crumbling, the world is reminded. They bleed, they hurt, they shatter, just like us. And maybe that's why this story feels so painfully relevant. Because beneath the titles, beneath the crowns, the grief is universal. Yet, we must ask, who was Catherine, Duchess of Kent, to inspire such devotion, such dependence, such irreplaceable loss? You may know her as the wife of the Duke of Kent, cousin to Queen Elizabeth II, but to those who truly saw her, she was far more than just a royal by marriage. Catherine was a woman who, at one point, shocked the entire establishment by quietly stepping back from royal duties. A woman who pursued her own passions, teaching music to children in modest schools, prioritizing compassion over prestige. She was the kind of royal who preferred the company of ordinary people to the glittering halls of state dinners. She lived not in the spotlight, but in the steady, grounding role of anchor to her husband. So now, as the Duke of Kent faces his twilight years without her, what really becomes of a man who says openly, "I won't survive"? Do we take his words literally? Or do we see them as the symbolic cry of someone who has lost the part of himself that gave life meaning? That is the mystery we must explore. But let's not rush. To understand the full weight of this tragedy, we must first revisit their story, the unlikely romance, the endurance through decades of royal turbulence, the sacrifices they both made, and the quiet devotion that made them inseparable. Because only then can we truly grasp why this loss cuts so deeply. Picture the scene. The Duke of Kent, a man now in his late 80s, sitting silently in his study. Around him, walls lined with photographs, wedding portraits, family gatherings, moments frozen in black and white and fading color. There she is, Catherine, always by his side. Regal, yes, but also gentle, unassuming. Imagine the silence in that room now. No soft footsteps approaching. No voice offering quiet reassurance. Just the echo of absence. And here lies the contradiction. A royal household filled with servants, courtiers, staff. And yet, for the Duke, none of them matter. None of them can fill the void Catherine has left. Isn't it striking that a man who has everything in material terms can still be left with nothing when love is taken away? But here's the deeper layer. This isn't just about the Duke's personal heartbreak. It is also about what his words reveal about the monarchy itself. When he says, "I won't survive," he's not just speaking about his grief. He's inadvertently exposing a truth about the royals. Their entire existence, built on structure and tradition, crumbles without the private foundations of love and loyalty. And let's not forget the timing. With the monarchy already under scrutiny, King Charles navigating his reign, Prince William preparing for his future role, and Prince Harry creating chaos from afar, the Duke's grief becomes a mirror for the fragility of the entire institution. The death of Catherine is not just a family tragedy. It is a symbolic moment in royal history, the fading of an era. But before we reach that conclusion, let's pause and consider. How did Catherine, Duchess of Kent, live her final days? What quiet goodbyes were exchanged? What tears were shed in the privacy of their home, far away from the public eye? What legacy does she leave behind, not just for the Duke, but for all of us watching from afar? These are the questions that will carry us through this journey. And as we delve deeper, we will uncover the love story that began decades ago, the private battles fought silently behind palace walls, and the devastating reality of loss at the twilight of life. Because grief has a way of revealing truth. And the truth here is both heartbreaking and profoundly human. The Duke of Kent, once a figure of quiet resilience, is now a man stripped bare by sorrow. And his words, "I won't survive," leave us wondering, is this simply the pain of the moment, or is it a foreshadowing of something more final? But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Behind every crown lies a love story that the world often overlooks. We see the grandeur, the jewels, the ceremonies, but rarely do we see the raw, human connections that fuel these lives. For the Duke of Kent and his wife, Catherine, their love story was not one of constant headlines or dazzling public appearances. It was quiet, steady, and deeply rooted in a kind of loyalty that defied the often turbulent landscape of royal life. But how did it begin? And how did it grow into the kind of love that left the Duke whispering in despair after her passing? Picture a young Prince Edward, Duke of Kent, cousin to the future Queen Elizabeth II. Born into duty, raised with the weight of expectation, his life was mapped out from the very beginning. Public service, military training, a role to play in the larger machinery of the monarchy. Yet even in this carefully constructed world, fate had other plans. He met Catherine Worsley, a woman who would stand out not for being a socialite, not for being a media darling, but for her sincerity and depth. Can you imagine what it must have been like for Catherine? Stepping into the whirlwind of royal life, expected to embody grace, composure, and duty, while still holding on to her individuality. She wasn't born into this life. She chose it. And yet, she would go on to redefine what it meant to be a duchess. Their marriage in 1961 wasn't just another royal wedding. It was the merging of two worlds. But what's fascinating is how different their story was compared to other royal unions. While Charles and Diana's relationship collapsed under pressure, while even the Queen and Prince Philip's marriage endured its share of strains, Catherine and Edward's bond was quietly strong. They weren't the faces splashed across every magazine cover. They didn't seek the limelight. Instead, they cultivated something private, something enduring. Doesn't that make you wonder, was their love story more authentic because it wasn't constantly displayed for the world to judge? Think about this. Catherine was the only royal bride in more than 4 centuries to marry into the family at York Minster rather than Westminster Abbey. Already, their path was unique, almost a statement. She wasn't following the script exactly. She was writing her own chapter. And that set the tone for their marriage. Yes, they fulfilled their royal roles, but they always seemed to do so with a certain detachment from the pomp, a preference for the personal over the public. And yet, behind this quiet love story were sacrifices. Catherine endured miscarriages, a silent struggle that rarely made headlines, but deeply affected their marriage. Can you imagine the heartbreak of such losses in the midst of royal expectation? A family line to continue, heirs to be produced, duty pressing down at every turn. And still, together, they faced it. Their marriage wasn't just about love, it was about endurance. The Duke himself was not spared from challenges. His royal duties were relentless, his health fragile at times, and his role, always just slightly in the shadow of his more famous cousin, Queen Elizabeth, meant he was often overlooked. Yet, Catherine remained his anchor, a steadying force in a world that could so easily consume anyone who dared to live within it. But let's not romanticize too much without facing the truth. Their marriage was not a fairy tale. Catherine, famously, struggled with the demands of royal life. She eventually stepped away from public duties in the 1990s, retreating into a quieter existence. Some saw it as controversial. Some called it a rebellion. But for her, it was survival. And the Duke? He supported her. That's rare, isn't it? In a family where tradition and duty often outweigh personal happiness, Edward stood by her decision. And maybe that is the heart of their love story. Not the grand events, not the glittering balls or the regal processions, but the quiet decisions made in private, the decision to stand together, to endure, to let love be the anchor rather than the throne. Doesn't that say more about devotion than any crown ever could? Now imagine this. Decades pass. Their children grow. The monarchy itself changes. Elizabeth's reign stretches on. Charles ages into his role as heir. The next generation steps forward. And through all of it, the Duke and Duchess remain side by side. Not grabbing headlines. Not stirring scandal. Just living, loving, enduring. Their bond becomes almost invisible to the world at large. But for those who knew them, it was unbreakable. And this is why her death at 92 was not just the loss of a duchess. It was the collapse of the Duke's very foundation. How do you go on when the person who shaped every corner of your private world, who softened the harshness of public duty, is suddenly gone? We've seen royals break under pressure before. We've seen grief shatter the carefully maintained facade. But this feels different. The Duke of Kent, a man who has spent nearly 9 decades mastering the art of composure, could not hold back. His words cut through centuries of royal restraint. I won't survive without her. Raw, honest, human. But here's where the intrigue deepens. What do those words really mean? Was it just a moment of despair, a cry of heartbreak uttered in the fog of grief? Or was it a foreshadowing? A hint that the Duke himself was preparing to say goodbye to this world now that his partner was gone. History offers us chilling parallels. Long-married couples who pass within months, sometimes even days, of one another. Could this be one of those stories unfolding in real time? And yet, we're left with another question. If their love was so strong, why was it kept so quiet? Why was their story not celebrated in the same way as others? Could it be that true love doesn't need an audience? That the truest stories are the ones we only uncover in moments of tragedy? Because here's the thing. While the world obsesses over scandals, over headlines about Harry and Meghan, or speculation about Charles and William, the Duke and Duchess of Kent lived a story that was deeper, quieter, and perhaps more enduring. A story that only truly reveals its magnitude now, as one half fades into history and the other is left behind, broken. And so we circle back to where we began. A crown, a palace, a title, none of it protects from the devastation of losing your soul's companion. None of it shields you from the silence of an empty room, the absence of a familiar voice. The Duke of Kent's story reminds us that behind the crowns and the centuries-old traditions lies a reality as fragile as any other marriage, any other love. But what came next after Catherine's passing was something no one expected. The Duke's grief did not remain behind closed doors. It began to seep into the wider royal family, touching a nerve that left courtiers and even senior royals shaken. And that ripple effect is where the story takes a haunting turn. What does it mean to live as a royal, yet choose a path that deliberately turns away from the spotlight? Catherine, Duchess of Kent, was not a headline-chasing figure, nor a woman eager to wield the weight of her title. Instead, she carved out a role defined by restraint, compassion, and quiet strength. And perhaps that is why her death at 92 carries such a profound resonance. Her absence is not just the end of a chapter in the Duke of Kent's life. It is the silencing of a voice that spoke softly, yet carried enormous weight in the fabric of the monarchy. Think about the contrast for a moment. While Diana was adored for her charisma, Meghan is dissected for her ambition, and Camilla scrutinized for her past, Catherine chose something different. She removed herself almost entirely from the media machine, and by doing so, she became something rare, a royal who was respected not for visibility, but for authenticity. Doesn't it make you wonder, how did she maintain that balance, walking a line so few in her position have ever managed? Let's step back in time. Born Catherine Lucy Mary Worsley in 1933, she was not raised in palaces or surrounded by endless fanfare. She grew up in Yorkshire, in a family of landed gentry, with a childhood rooted in tradition but not drowned in royal expectations. It's important to recognize this distinction. She entered the royal family not as someone molded from birth to wear a crown, but as someone who chose love, knowing full well it came with a life of immense sacrifice. When she married Prince Edward, Duke of Kent, in 1961 at York Minster, a ceremony unique in itself, breaking from the usual tradition of Westminster Abbey. It symbolized more than just a wedding. It was the start of a partnership that would both uphold and quietly challenge the royal order. Catherine was stepping into one of the oldest royal families in Europe, and yet she never let the institution completely define her. And that's where her quiet strength emerges. Early in her role, Catherine fulfilled her duties with grace: public engagements, royal tours, charity appearances. She did what was expected, but over time, the strain began to show. She endured miscarriages, an often hidden but deeply painful part of her story. Behind the cameras, behind the carefully worded press releases, was a woman carrying silent grief. Have you ever wondered how many royals have lived with unspoken heartbreak, their private pain buried beneath protocol? Catherine lived it, and still, she pressed forward. But here's the twist. She eventually chose to step away. In the 1990s, Catherine, Duchess of Kent, made a decision that sent ripples through royal circles. She effectively retired from public life. She turned away from the relentless royal calendar and embraced something altogether different: teaching. Yes, imagine this: a duchess in classrooms, teaching music to children in ordinary schools. No titles, no pomp, just Catherine, sitting at a piano, helping students discover their voices. Isn't that extraordinary? At a time when many royals cling to their roles, desperate for relevance, Catherine willingly laid hers down. She chose humanity over hierarchy, passion over protocol. And the public, rather than condemning her, admired her for it. In fact, it may be this act of humility that cemented her legacy more than any ribbon-cutting ceremony or state banquet could have. Let's add another layer. Catherine converted to Roman Catholicism in 1994, an act that, in royal history, was seismic. Remember, the British monarchy itself is the defender of the Church of England. For a royal to publicly embrace Catholicism was not just unusual. It was almost rebellious. And yet, she did it. Quietly, with dignity, without turning it into a spectacle. Doesn't that speak volumes about her strength? To follow her conscience, even when it clashed with centuries of tradition, is a testament to her character. And what about her marriage? Through it all, the Duke of Kent remained by her side. He did not pressure her to conform entirely. He allowed her space to be who she was, a rarity in the royal family. Can you see now why his grief runs so deep? For decades, she was his anchor, the steady figure who gave him both personal and spiritual strength. Without her, he is not simply a widower. He is a man untethered. But let's consider another angle: the public perception of Catherine. While she stepped away, she never fully disappeared. Those who encountered her often described her as warm, approachable, and deeply empathetic. She was known to write personal letters to fans, to spend time with people who would otherwise be ignored by the royal machinery. Isn't it ironic? By withdrawing from the institution, she actually became more relatable than many royals who worked tirelessly to remain in the public eye. And yet, here lies the bittersweet irony of her story. In choosing humility, Catherine became invisible to history books dominated by louder, more dramatic figures. But her impact was no less profound. The students she taught, the charities she quietly supported, the dignity with which she carried herself, all of it now forms the foundation of her legacy. So when the Duke of Kent says, "I won't survive without her," it isn't just a dramatic line from a grieving husband. It is a reflection of what she truly was to him: his partner, his conscience, his stabilizer. Without her, the careful balance of his world collapses. Now, pause for a moment. Imagine the Duke walking through their home now. The piano, once filled with Catherine's music, sits silent. The rooms that once carried her laughter echo with emptiness. Even in the grandeur of royal estates, grief shrinks everything down to silence. Isn't it haunting how absence can feel louder than presence? And yet, Catherine's departure doesn't just leave the Duke bereft. It leaves the royal family with one less voice of quiet integrity, one less figure who bridged the gap between monarchy and humanity. And in a family plagued with scandals, feuds, and public criticisms, can they really afford to lose someone like her? But here's the twist you didn't see coming. Catherine's quiet exit from life may not only mark the end of her own story, but also signal the unraveling of the Duke himself. Because the truth is, his grief is not contained. It has begun to ripple outward, unsettling the family, raising questions about his own future, and leaving courtiers whispering, What happens if his words prove prophetic? Because as strong as Catherine was in life, her absence might just prove too heavy for the Duke to bear. And what follows could be even more heartbreaking than her death. But what came next in her final days revealed a side of this love story that the world had never seen before, an ending that was as intimate as it was devastating. Those were the words. Simple, trembling, and utterly devastating. Words that slipped past the polished armor of a man born into duty, raised to embody restraint, and trained his entire life to hold his emotions behind the cold mask of royalty. Yet, in the aftermath of Catherine's passing, the Duke of Kent shattered centuries of silence with one raw confession. And those words are now echoing through the monarchy, through the halls of Buckingham Palace, and into the hearts of anyone who has ever known the weight of grief. Pause for a moment. Let them sink in. I won't survive without her. Have you ever heard a royal speak in such vulnerable terms? Royals are taught to project strength, to smile even when they're drowning inside. But here, for the first time, we see the humanity stripped bare. And doesn't that raise an unsettling question? If a man like the Duke can collapse under grief, what does that reveal about the monarchy itself? Let's unravel this. For decades, the Duke of Kent has been one of the quieter figures in the royal family. Unlike Prince Philip, who often commanded headlines, or Prince Charles, whose every move was scrutinized, Edward lived mostly in the shadows. Yet he served the crown faithfully, through military duty, through representing the Queen at events, through a lifetime of quiet service. And through it all, Catherine was there. She wasn't just a wife. She was his anchor, his stabilizer, the one constant in a life that was anything but ordinary. So when she passed, something inside him broke. His words, unguarded, uncalculated, were more than just grief. They were prophecy. Courtiers close to the family whispered that they had never seen him so fragile, so disoriented, so utterly lost. One aide reportedly said, "It was as if the Duke himself vanished when the Duchess did." Doesn't that image strike you? That without her, even his identity seemed to collapse? Now, let's dig deeper. What do those words actually mean? Was the Duke expressing the fear of loneliness that comes after losing a lifelong partner? Or was he confessing a deeper truth, that his body, his will, his very spirit could not endure the weight of such a loss? Medical experts talk about broken heart syndrome. It's real. Grief can trigger heart attacks, strokes, and a cascade of health issues. Countless couples who spent lifetimes together have died within weeks or months of each other. Think of Queen Victoria, who lived in mourning after Albert's death. Think of modern stories where elderly spouses pass away almost hand in hand. Could this be where the Duke's story is headed? But beyond the personal tragedy, let's consider the ripple effect. Royals don't grieve in isolation. Their emotions, their choices, even their whispered words, reverberate through the institution. When the Duke said, "I won't survive without her," it wasn't just a private admission. It became a royal earthquake. Courtiers worried about his health. Family members feared the worst. Even King Charles, facing his own pressures as monarch, reportedly felt the weight of his cousin's despair. Because here's the truth. If the Duke of Kent were to follow his wife soon, it wouldn't just be another quiet royal death. It would symbolize the fading of an entire generation. But let's not forget the personal element. Imagine the Duke, waking up alone in a bed that once held her warmth, sitting down at meals with an empty chair beside him, walking through gardens that once echoed with her footsteps. Can you see how every corner of his life is now haunted by absence? And when he utters those words, "I won't survive without her," he's not exaggerating. He's describing the suffocating reality of his existence. Still, there's another angle. What if those words weren't just despair? What if they were also devotion? A vow, in a sense, that his life is no longer his own without her. In a monarchy obsessed with duty, maybe this is his ultimate rebellion. Choosing love over survival, devotion over endurance. Doesn't that make you wonder whether his grief itself is a kind of final love letter to Catherine? And yet, we cannot ignore the ominous undercurrent. Behind closed doors, whispers are growing louder. The Duke's health has always been delicate. His age places him firmly in the realm of risk. With Catherine gone, the question is not if he will decline, but how quickly. Courtiers are quietly preparing. Family members are bracing. And the public, still processing Catherine's loss, may soon be confronted with another farewell. Think about what this means. Two deaths, close together. A love story that ends not with separation, but with reunion in death. It's haunting. It's heartbreaking. And it's a reminder that even within the gilded walls of royalty, love can destroy as much as it sustains. So here's the question for you. When the Duke said, "I won't survive without her," did he mean it as a metaphor for grief? Or was it a literal truth, a prophecy waiting to unfold? Because history tells us that love this deep rarely allows one partner to remain long after the other has gone. But what came next proved that his words were not just personal. They sent shockwaves through the entire royal family, forcing them to confront not only his mortality, but the fragile mortality of the monarchy itself. What happens to a royal family when grief stops being private and becomes a crack in the foundation of the monarchy? The passing of Catherine, Duchess of Kent, was not only the personal tragedy of a devoted husband. It sent shockwaves through the wider royal family, stirring emotions, fears, and tensions that reveal just how fragile this institution has become. Let's set the stage. The Duke of Kent is not just any royal. He is a first cousin of Queen Elizabeth II, a figure who has represented the monarchy faithfully for decades. He has been present at state occasions, military commemorations, and countless ceremonial duties. His role was always understated, but it mattered. And with Catherine by his side, he carried it with dignity. But now, with her gone, and with his haunting words, "I won't survive without her," spreading beyond private whispers, the entire family has been forced to face an uncomfortable reality: mortality. Can you imagine the ripple effect inside palace walls? King Charles, already burdened with the enormous weight of his new reign, now faces the possibility of another high-profile royal loss. Prince William, preparing to carry the monarchy into the next generation, cannot help but see in the Duke's grief a foreshadowing of the challenges he will one day endure. Even Prince Harry, though estranged and thousands of miles away, is pulled into this emotional current, if only because it reminds the world of how grief, from Diana to now, continues to stalk this family. But here's the irony. Royals are trained to grieve in silence. They are expected to maintain composure, to embody tradition rather than emotion. Remember how Queen Elizabeth was criticized for her restrained reaction after Diana's death? The monarchy thrives on distance. And yet, the Duke of Kent has broken that code. With one line, "I won't survive without her," he has turned private despair into public revelation. Doesn't that unravel the myth of the Stoic monarchy? Doesn't it show that even within Buckingham Palace, grief can be louder than protocol? Now, let's talk about the Queen Consort, Camilla. Those close to her understand the balancing act she must perform, offering compassion, showing support, but never allowing personal grief to overshadow the role of monarchy. Catherine's passing and the Duke's response remind her and others that the human cost of royal duty is inescapable. In moments like this, even the most seasoned royals are shaken. And what about Princess Anne? Known for her resilience and no-nonsense approach, even she reportedly softened in the wake of the Duchess's death. For a family often accused of being cold, Catherine's passing forced moments of rare tenderness. Imagine Anne, often seen as steel-willed, sitting quietly with her cousin, offering comfort. Isn't it remarkable how grief can dissolve even the hardest exteriors? But here's the darker side. Whispers inside the palace suggest that the Duke's fragile state has heightened concerns about the institution itself. The monarchy is already stretched thin. Charles is dealing with questions of relevance. William is shouldering increasing responsibility, and Harry's estrangement has left a void. If the Duke of Kent were to follow his wife soon, it would mark not just the end of an era, but the loss of another senior royal presence. And the symbolism of two deaths, so close together, would send a chilling message. The monarchy is not invincible. Consider the optics. The public watched Elizabeth and Philip's partnership endure for more than 70 years. When Philip died, the Queen soldiered on, embodying duty until her own passing. That image reassured the nation. But the Duke of Kent has offered no such reassurance. His words carry the opposite message, that without love, survival is impossible. Can you see how destabilizing that is for a monarchy that depends on projecting strength? And then there are the grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Younger generations of the family, already caught between tradition and modernity, are now confronted with the fragility of the old guard. For them, Catherine's passing is not just the loss of a grandmother or great-aunt. It is a glimpse into the fading of an entire generation that once defined stability. Here's a striking thought. What if the Duke's grief has done something no scandal ever could? What if it has forced the monarchy to reveal its humanity in a way that people actually respond to? Because in the end, despite centuries of tradition, the monarchy's survival depends on connection. And right now, the Duke's raw words may resonate more with the public than all of Charles's carefully crafted speeches. But make no mistake, within the family, his words are not just being seen as emotional, they are being seen as dangerous. If his health falters, if he were to pass soon, the narrative would be one of love so deep that it destroyed him. The monarchy, already under pressure, could find itself dragged into a storyline that feels more like Shakespearean tragedy than modern leadership. And that is the heart of this chapter. Catherine's death was not just the end of her story. It was the beginning of a crisis for the royal family, a crisis of emotion, of symbolism, of survival itself. Because if the Duke of Kent, a man who embodied decades of quiet service, cannot survive his grief, what does that say about the monarchy he served? But what came next only deepened the unease, because the story of the Duke cannot be understood without uncovering his hidden role in the monarchy, the sacrifices he made, the burdens he carried, and the ways Catherine's absence has left those roles unbearably empty. Every royal figure has a story the public only half knows. Some stand in the blinding light of the crown, Queen Elizabeth II, Prince Charles, Diana. Others live in the shadows, working tirelessly, quietly, without ever receiving the glory or recognition. The Duke of Kent belongs to the latter. For decades, his presence was almost ghost-like at public events. Always there, always dignified, yet rarely the focus. And yet, without him, the machinery of the monarchy would have looked very different. His hidden history inside the royal family reveals why Catherine's death is so devastating, not only for him personally, but for the institution he helped uphold. Let's rewind the clock. Prince Edward, Duke of Kent, was born in 1935, a cousin of Queen Elizabeth II and the eldest son of Prince George, Duke of Kent. His father died tragically in a plane crash when Edward was just 6 years old, thrusting him into a world of responsibility far earlier than most. Imagine being a child, barely able to comprehend loss, and suddenly carrying the title of Duke. That kind of weight shapes a person for life, don't you think? From that moment, duty was not optional. It was destiny. He grew up in the long shadow of the monarchy, surrounded by the traditions, expectations, and rigid codes that define royal life. His early years were marked by military service. He trained at Sandhurst and served in the armed forces, including time in Germany during the Cold War era. Military discipline shaped him. He was never flashy, never flamboyant, but steady, loyal, and enduring. But here's where his hidden history becomes more intriguing. The Duke of Kent, despite being relatively unknown to the public, played crucial roles in representing the monarchy. He often stood in for the Queen at international events. He was the president of the All England Lawn Tennis Club for decades, presenting Wimbledon trophies to countless champions. He served as president of the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, honoring those who fell in battle. And he carried out hundreds of engagements that kept the monarchy's presence alive in places the Queen and Prince Charles could not always reach. Doesn't that make you wonder? How many times have we seen him in photographs, on the edges of ceremonies, without truly realizing the importance of his presence? Unlike more prominent royals, Edward never sought attention. His duty was quieter, almost invisible, but that invisibility was precisely what made him indispensable. He was the thread that stitched together moments of tradition, military history, and public ceremony. Think of him as the supporting beam of a grand old house. You don't notice it, but remove it, and the structure begins to weaken. And through all of this, Catherine was by his side. She saw the weight he carried, the obligations that often kept him from being simply a husband or a father. She balanced him, offering him the personal comfort he could never find in duty. Together, they created a partnership that allowed him to endure a lifetime of service without collapse. Can you see now why her absence feels like the unraveling of his entire world? Let's dig deeper into his role. The Duke of Kent was often the monarchy's bridge to military communities. He held the position of Field Marshal and had countless honorary military titles. Soldiers respected him not because he demanded it, but because he understood them. He had lived among them, trained with them, shared in their experiences. And yet, he never used this as a platform for personal glory. He was the quiet royal, the one who worked not for applause, but for duty. But here's the irony. His quiet life of service meant that when tragedy struck, when Catherine passed away, there was no public image of him as a towering, unshakable figure. Instead, the world saw the reality, an elderly man, fragile, devastated, admitting he could not survive without her. And that contrast, between the hidden history of strength and the present vulnerability, makes his story even more haunting. Behind palace walls, courtiers know just how much the Duke sacrificed. He endured illnesses, moments of exhaustion, and decades of being overlooked by the media. But he never complained. He simply carried on. The Queen herself reportedly relied on him at times, knowing he would never fail her in representing the crown. And yet, now that Catherine is gone, the question emerges. Can the Duke carry on? Or has the burden finally broken him? Consider this. The monarchy is losing not just individuals, but an entire generation of royals who embodied quiet duty. Elizabeth, Philip, now Catherine, and perhaps soon Edward, all gone or fading. The younger royals live in a different world, one defined by media spectacle, Instagram posts, and public scrutiny. Who will carry the quiet dignity of the past when they are gone? Isn't that the deeper tragedy here? Not just the Duke's personal grief, but the end of an era of service defined by humility rather than attention? And let's not ignore the darker whispers. The Duke of Kent's hidden history is also marked by struggles. Health concerns, financial difficulties that forced him to adapt, and the unrelenting pressure of duty without the relief of recognition. Some close to him have said that Catherine was the only one who truly understood the cost of his role. Without her, the fear is not just that he will grieve, but that he will collapse under the weight of a life that suddenly feels empty of meaning. Think about it. When someone spends their entire life in service, what happens when the one person who gave that service purpose disappears? For Edward, Catherine wasn't just his wife. She was his why. And without a why, can duty alone keep a man alive? But here's the most chilling thought. When Catherine died, it wasn't just the end of her life. It may have been the signal that the Duke's own story is drawing to a close. Because a man whose entire identity was split between duty and devotion now has only half left. And half a life is hardly a life at all. Yet, the story doesn't end here. Because while the Duke's hidden history reveals decades of sacrifice, what follows shows the cruel irony of grief in the monarchy, that even in heartbreak, public duty demands appearances. And what unfolded in the days after Catherine's passing highlighted the painful divide between the Duke's private agony and the public's expectations. But what came next exposed a chilling contrast. The world saw the Duke step forward in public mourning, but behind those appearances was a private pain so deep that even courtiers began to fear the worst. The world sees the black suits, the solemn processions, the polished composure of a royal family in mourning. The cameras capture the bowed heads, the quiet hymns, the moments of ritual. But what they don't capture, what they can never capture, is the raw pain that explodes in the silence once the crowds have dispersed and the cameras are gone. For the Duke of Kent, mourning his beloved Catherine meant living in that impossible divide. The public expectation of dignity and the private reality of devastation. Picture the scene. The funeral procession, carefully orchestrated, the Duchess of Kent's coffin draped in flowers, surrounded by symbols of centuries of tradition. The royal family gathered in their customary rows, stoic, composed, their grief hidden behind the mask of protocol. To the public eye, it was a fitting farewell to a duchess who had lived with dignity. But behind those cold images, the Duke was fighting something far darker. Every step he took, every handshake, every nod to tradition, was a battle against collapse. Can you imagine the strength it must take to stand upright when your heart is screaming to fall to your knees? This is the paradox of royal grief. The public demands spectacle, ritual, the illusion of control. Yet grief is chaos. It doesn't follow a schedule, it doesn't respect traditions, it doesn't wait for the cameras to leave. And so, the Duke of Kent found himself trapped between two worlds. In public, he was the Duke. In private, he was simply Edward, an old man whose reason for living had been ripped away. Let's dwell on the funeral itself. Observers noticed the Duke's frailty, his hands trembling, his movements slower, his eyes fixed not on the ritual, but on the coffin before him. It was as if he couldn't look away, as if by staring he could somehow stop time, stop her from being taken away forever. Doesn't that strike you? That even in a hall filled with the most powerful family in Britain, one man was reduced to the simplest, most human act, clinging to the side of his wife one last time? But here's where the irony cuts deep. In public, his grief was restrained, as tradition demanded. Behind closed doors, it was volcanic. Courtiers whispered of his outbursts, moments where he would weep uncontrollably, repeating the same line, "I won't survive without her." Family members, used to his quiet resilience, were shaken. They had never seen him like this. Even King Charles, no stranger to grief himself, reportedly expressed concern. The Duke wasn't just mourning. He was unraveling. And that's where the divide grows dangerous. Because public appearances require strength. But every time the Duke steps into the public eye, the contrast between his polished exterior and his shattered interior grows more pronounced. Isn't that a haunting thought? That the very act of appearing strong in public may actually be accelerating his decline in private? Now let's consider the symbolism. Royal funerals are designed to remind the world of continuity. The crown never falters, the monarchy never weakens, the family endures. But Catherine's funeral, and the Duke's frailty within it, sent a different message. Instead of continuity, it revealed fragility. Instead of timelessness, it exposed mortality. For those watching closely, it was less a symbol of endurance and more a warning. The old guard is fading, and it is fading fast. And what about the public reaction? Many admired the Duke's composure, praising his dignity. Yet those same observers, if they looked closely enough, saw the cracks. The way he leaned slightly on family members for support. The way his lips trembled as hymns were sung. The way his words, when he spoke briefly, caught in his throat. To the casual viewer, it was a standard royal farewell. To those who understood grief, it was a man fighting for every breath. But here's the cruel irony. Even in mourning, duty doesn't end. Within days of Catherine's passing, The Duke was expected to fulfill small appearances, to show the monarchy remained intact. Can you imagine the cruelty of that? To bury your wife and then smile politely at strangers, shake hands, stand straight for the cameras? How many of us could endure that? And yet, that is what royalty demands. But what the world didn't see, what was hidden from cameras, was the aftermath. Alone in his residence, the Duke reportedly shut himself away for hours at a time, refusing company, sitting in silence. One aide described walking past his study late at night and hearing nothing but the sound of his chair creaking, as though he sat there, unmoving, lost in thought. That image, the emptiness of a royal palace echoing with silence, is perhaps more powerful than any funeral procession. Doesn't it make you wonder? What is the price of being royal? Is it the privilege of palaces and titles? Or is it the unbearable weight of being expected to perform even when your heart is shattered? For the Duke of Kent, the answer seems clear. The price is everything. And without Catherine, the debt has finally come due. Yet this chapter doesn't end with his grief contained, because whispers began to circulate after the funeral. Whispers of a private gesture, a moment so raw and unplanned that it left courtiers stunned and the family quietly fearful. But what came next at the funeral, a single, heartbreaking gesture from the Duke himself, made many wonder if this was not just his farewell to Catherine, but his farewell to life. Duty. That single word has defined the monarchy for centuries. It is the iron backbone of royal life, the reason why the crown endures despite scandal, betrayal, and shifting public opinion. But what happens when duty collides with something far greater, human fragility? What happens when the expectation to stand tall, to smile, to represent the nation, slams into the reality of a man too broken by grief to even carry on? That is the storm the Duke of Kent now finds himself in. From his earliest years, Edward was taught that duty comes first. The monarchy survives because individuals within it suppress their personal desires and pain. When his father died in a plane crash, he was only 6 years old, yet the title of Duke was instantly placed upon his small shoulders. Duty didn't wait for him to grow up. It never does. And for decades, he carried it out faithfully. Military service, royal engagements, state occasions, always present, rarely praised, but always fulfilling the expectation. But grief changes everything. The loss of Catherine has ripped away the protective shield of discipline he spent nearly 9 decades building. For the first time, duty feels impossible. Imagine being asked to stand in front of the world and embody strength when you can barely summon the strength to rise from your chair in the morning. Can you feel the impossibility of that demand? Royal history is full of moments when grief collided with duty. Queen Victoria became a recluse after Prince Albert's death, wearing black for the rest of her life and withdrawing from public duties. The monarchy suffered for it, nearly collapsing under criticism. Queen Elizabeth II faced her own moment of reckoning after Diana's death, criticized for prioritizing duty over visible emotion. The monarchy learned from those mistakes, carefully balancing appearances with sympathy ever since. But the Duke of Kent is not a monarch. He does not have the buffer of an entire institution shielding him. His fragility is exposed, raw, undeniable. And here's the irony. His sense of duty may be what destroys him. Sources close to the palace whisper that the Duke, despite his grief, still insists on attending certain ceremonial events. He knows that stepping away entirely would feel like abandoning his role. Yet every appearance drains him further. One aide described watching him at a remembrance service, his shoulders slumped, his eyes hollow, his voice barely audible. He was there in body, the aide said, but not in spirit. Doesn't that image strike you? A man so broken, yet still forcing himself forward because the crown demands it? But here's the darker side. That very devotion to duty may accelerate his decline. Doctors warn that grief takes a brutal toll on the elderly, increasing the risk of heart attacks, strokes, and cognitive decline. Combine that with the exhaustion of public appearances, and you have a recipe for collapse. And the Duke knows it. When he says, "I won't survive without her," he's not speaking in vague poetry. He's describing the brutal reality of his existence. Every day feels like a step closer to the end. Now, let's consider how this fragility is viewed by the wider family. King Charles, facing his own health struggles and the enormous weight of his new reign, is said to be torn. On one hand, he respects the Duke's devotion to duty. On the other, he worries that allowing him to continue will break him entirely. Prince William reportedly admires his cousin's quiet dignity, but cannot ignore the symbolic danger. The sight of a visibly frail Duke of Kent standing beside him at state occasions is not the image of strength the monarchy wants to project. Isn't that ironic? That the very authenticity of the Duke's grief threatens the carefully curated image of resilience the crown depends on? And yet, here's the twist. While the family sees fragility, the public sees humanity. Ordinary people watching the Duke stumble, watching him whisper about his wife, watching him struggle to fulfill duty even as he breaks, feel a connection. He's just like us, many have said. The paradox is painful. The monarchy's strength comes not from the performance of duty, but from the humanity it usually tries to hide. But for Edward, this is no paradox. It is torture. He is torn between two impossible choices: retreat into private grief and risk being seen as abandoning duty, or continue performing and destroy himself in the process. And that is where human fragility collides with royal expectation. Now let's ask the hardest question. Is the Duke of Kent's story heading toward the same trajectory as countless others? A man who simply cannot outlive his grief? We've seen it before. Elderly spouses who die within days or months of each other. Scientists call it the widowhood effect. History calls it love's final devotion. And the Duke, with his candid confession, seems to be walking that very path. Imagine the headlines if it happens. The Duke of Kent dies weeks after his wife. The narrative will not be one of weakness, but of devotion so deep it consumed him. And yet, within palace walls, that outcome terrifies the family. Because while the public may see romance in such a tragedy, the monarchy sees instability. Two losses in quick succession would send a chilling message. The old guard is vanishing, and with it, the monarchy's very foundation. And here lies the cruel irony. The monarchy survives because of duty, but the Duke of Kent's story proves that even duty cannot withstand the power of grief. It exposes the fragility of an institution built on human beings who are, in the end, no different from the rest of us. But what came next made the whispers inside Buckingham Palace even louder. Because in the days after Catherine's funeral, rumors emerged of a private conversation between the Duke and one of his most trusted aides. A conversation that revealed just how close he may be to fulfilling his haunting prophecy. What do the walls of Buckingham Palace really hear when the world isn't watching? Behind the polished ceremonies, behind the gilded doors, the palace is alive with whispers. Courtiers talk. Staff confide in one another. Rumors swirl in the shadows. And when grief tears through the family, those whispers multiply. In the aftermath of Catherine's death, and the Duke of Kent's chilling words, "I won't survive without her," the Palace Whisper Network came alive with stories, fears, and quiet predictions. Think about it. This is a family where silence is a weapon. Secrets are currency. But grief has a way of loosening tongues. Suddenly, people who normally keep their observations buried beneath layers of loyalty began to share what they'd seen. And what they'd seen shook even the most seasoned of courtiers. One aide, speaking in hushed tones, described the Duke as a shadow of himself. He was skipping meals, unable to sleep, and wandering the halls late at night, muttering Catherine's name. Imagine that, an elderly man, fragile and broken, roaming through the grand corridors of his residence, calling out for a wife who would never answer again. Doesn't that image feel more haunting than any headline? Others noted his declining health. His hands trembled more than usual. His gait was unsteady. It's not just grief, one insider whispered. It's as though his body has already decided to follow her. Doctors were reportedly called in more than once, not just to treat his frailty, but to calm the fears of those around him. The phrase broken heart syndrome was even mentioned behind closed doors. Could it be that the Duke's prophecy was already unfolding? But here's where the whispers grow darker. According to one courtier, the Duke confided privately to a long-serving aide, "My time is close. She's waiting for me." Imagine the weight of those words. This wasn't just a passing expression of grief. It was almost an acceptance, a resignation. Doesn't that sound less like despair and more like a man preparing for the end? And those words did not remain private for long. In palaces where gossip trickles faster than water through stone, The confession spread quietly but swiftly. Senior royals heard. Staff whispered in corners. Even Charles, already burdened with his reign, was said to have been shaken. Because here's the truth. When one royal falters, it threatens the entire image of stability. Now let's pause and ask, why do these whispers matter? Because the monarchy is built on perception. The image of resilience, continuity, and unbreakable duty is its strongest weapon. But the Duke of Kent, with his grief laid bare, threatens that image. Whispers of his decline, his confessions, his frailty, all serve as reminders that the monarchy is not invincible. And in an era where public support is already fragile, that is a dangerous perception to spread. But the whispers did not stop at his health. Some insiders revealed an even more chilling detail, a letter. It was said that before Catherine's death, the Duke had written her a private note, something deeply personal, never meant for public eyes. In it, he reportedly expressed his desire to join her soon, if she were to go first. The letter was not intended as a goodbye, it was a vow, a promise that their bond would not be broken by death. Doesn't that send shivers down your spine? If true, the Duke's current words are not just grief. They're the fulfillment of a pact made long before Catherine drew her last breath. And yet, even in the midst of this haunting atmosphere, not all whispers were sorrowful. Some courtiers spoke of a strange peace that seemed to settle over him after his initial outbursts. He is grieving, yes, one said, but it's almost as though he's already with her. What did they mean by that? Could it be that the Duke no longer feels part of the living world, that he's already halfway across the threshold? But here's the cruelest irony. While the Duke speaks of Catherine waiting for him, the palace machinery grinds on. Staff plan appearances. Letters must be answered. The image of the monarchy must be maintained. It's a brutal clash between personal devastation and institutional demand. And those trapped in the middle, the aides, the courtiers, the family members, are left whispering in fear of what might happen next. Because history is watching. The monarchy has weathered scandal after scandal, but nothing destabilizes it like death. And if the Duke of Kent fulfills his chilling prophecy soon, it won't just be the loss of another royal. It will be the symbolic end of an era. A quiet generation of dutiful royals vanishing before our eyes, replaced by a younger generation defined more by drama than dignity. But what came next after the whispers? The unveiling of Catherine's legacy, and the way the Duke clung to it in his darkest moments, showed just how deep her impact truly was, and why his grief may never heal.